Leslie Dingeni. He is the co-editor with William Gumede of a book called The Poverty of Ideas, South African Democracy and the Retreat of Intellectuals. Let me try and use your book here, Leslie, as perhaps a point of reference from which we start. You seem to suggest in this book, right across really, that there's been a retreat of intellectuals from the public space. Tell us more. I mean, how do you get to that conclusion?
No, I get to that conclusion, or rather we get to that conclusion, because I am a co-editor of the book.
Sure.
And there's a whole range of other contributors in the book who also shares the same view. So it's not like my own personal view. We get to that conclusion because in the book, as you would see, all of us are decrying the fact that in the current period in South Africa, in contrast to the other periods, which is mainly the period of the 80s and the 60s, and I'm not being nostalgic here, Kolera. If you really examine that period of the 60s, for example, the period of Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Ahmed Kathrada, etc., etc., it was a period at which intensive debates used to take place on the future of the country and on dealing with indeed a very critical historical moment in our country, that of colonialism, apartheid, and so on. So the architects who have brought us to this period at that time were people who were intellectuals of all sorts, who, under extreme difficult conditions, were prepared to engage on issues of society. However, on social issues of society, beyond that, I think there is no doubt in my mind that their intellectual discourse has brought South Africa to where South Africa is today.
All right, I'm going to bring my other guests in a second. And by the way, let me just welcome here in the studio again Nomboniso Gasa, researcher and analyst on gender, politics and cultural issues. Thank you very much, Nomboniso, for coming through.
Thank you, Kolani. Good morning to the listeners.
Thanks, indeed. Just picking up on what you're saying, Leslie, because I went through your book, I read your book. You mentioning names, of course, such as Nelson Mandela, Govan Mbeki, Ahmed Kathrada, and so on. But what I couldn't find is why you say they are public intellectuals. What determines a public intellectual?
Well, I think in the book we don't seek to try and give a recipe of what constitutes such an intellectual. And in fact, the discourse that we're raising in the book is not a new discourse. You will recall that in Italy, Antonio Gramsci also, in his works, raised similar questions. So what we seek to do in the book is not to define, neither do I have a magical answer to what constitutes the intellectual, but it is to reflect.
You know what the difficulty is going to be? If there are names that are thrown out there of public intellectuals, then one would want to know, why do you conclude that the Nelson Mandelas, that the Walter Sisulus, that the Ahmed Kathradas, and so on, were public intellectuals? What made them public intellectuals at a time?
It made them public intellectuals at the time because they were able, Kolani, both at the conceptual level, to engage with the powers that be at that time. Not only were they doing that, they were doing that selflessly, without seeking to gain any personal interest. And they were not only doing that at the theoretical level, but they were connecting both theory and praxis, as history would show over the years that they've done so, and they've continued to do so till up to today.
Selflessly. And it's quite interesting because also in your chapter you seek to distinguish between what you call a commercial intellectual, a celebrity intellectual, and so on. Just please give us those definitions then. What is a celebrity intellectual?
A celebrity intellectual, as I correctly point out in the book, it is the type of intellectual that does not seek to lose face, but seek to gain face. the intellectual that would be on television on an everyday basis, that would do that without at times questioning even the powers that be, the powers of the media, and being able to say at times, for example, when I came to this interview, I asked you about how much time do we have for this interview. Celebrity intellectuals seldom ask that question. They go there, no matter how serious the topic of the day is, and there is not enough time that you are given.
But isn't that too simplistic? Shouldn't you be judging the intellectual on the content of their presentation as opposed to the platform of their presentation?
But it is that problem, that presentation that I'm referring to, Kolani. What am I referring to when I'm talking about presentation? About that presentation, a topic like this does not deserve on air 5 minutes. You'll agree with me. But then you'll have, not all journalists, some journalists who would give a topic like this 5 or 10 minutes. Now, as an intellectual, when that is happening, you have to intervene. You need to be able to say that, really, I cannot present myself.
Let me bring in my other guests here. Songezo, your definition of a public intellectual, as opposed to an intellectual or as opposed to an analyst?
I think let me start by my understanding of what an intellectual is. And, and I think it's a subjective label that one should, as far as possible, never try to ascribe to themselves. I think on the basis of the works that you produce, in reflecting on various issues that affect society, others can arrive at the conclusion that one is an intellectual. I think we must be very circumspect about calling ourselves intellectual. That is the first thing. The second thing is we move to the public intellectualism. And personally, I define that as somebody who engages with the general public on issues that affect society, that they reflect upon. There might be scientific issues, social issues, or political issues, but they put themselves out there. There are people who write books, there are people who write articles, etc., but they engage the public. And in many instances provoke the kind of discussion that the daily grind of trying to survive and live does not permit us to do. And that's my definition of what it is.
Now, Leslie Dikeni, William Gumede, and a whole host of other writers in this book ultimately conclude that in South Africa, intellectuals have retreated. They conclude that we are not getting the kind of contribution from public intellectuals that we should be getting in order to enhance, deal with matters of society. Do you agree?
I fully agree with that. We might not agree on every reason, and there are several reasons why I come to that conclusion. Sure. The first one is in 1994, I think the euphoria of freedom and the explosion of many opportunities for a lot of people, in particular those who would have been labeled as intellectuals at the time, meant that there were other possibilities which did not necessarily have the coincidence of a public engagement, in other words, continuing with their intellectual engagement while gaining materially. That was the first reason. The second reason is that there was also a comfort that the people that ruled our country at the time had things sorted. We can pull back and relax now because there is no struggle to fight anymore. And they neglected questions like what is the meaning of freedom? What kind of society are we trying to build? What are the minute sinews of that society that are going to hold it together? What is the meaning of blackness? What are our gender relations going to be? What is the position of gay people going forward? Those kind of questions were never thoroughly interrogated because we abdicated, and when I say we, I mean society as a whole, we abdicated that responsibility to people in the political space. And we know what happened to the political space because it itself got poisoned by the advent of materialism and material opportunities coming through the state and business. And a lot of people that personally I consider to have deep, sufficient intellectual depth, you meet them in restaurants and they speak quietly or they talk to you on weekends. They don't engage the public.
Why? Is it out of fear?
Initially, I think it was because of the reasons that I'd given, there is a fear now amongst a lot of people that what I say in public is going to affect me materially. I'm going to lose my job. My business is going to suffer. And there are several examples which we can't name of people that have retreated because it has become economically difficult for them to continue doing so.
Nomboniso, please give me your thoughts on those issues. Do you certainly agree that there has been a retreat, and if so, why?
I think there is generally a mood in the country that does not encourage intellectual inquiry. And I think it's not only in South Africa. I think globally there is a mood where say things as simple, which is fine, but it becomes problematic when you have to say things as simplistic as you can, because there's an assumption that the public, society in general, doesn't have time to engage with those kinds of ideas. I think also that the retreat, if one can call it that, I'm not sure about the retreat myself. I think intellectuals thrive in different kind of contexts. I think if you want to understand deeper meanings of freedom and how to continue to invest in that, there are risks associated with that. You cannot be somebody who wants to engage with ideas and think that you're going to be socializing all the time. You cannot be a writer unless you are willing to have the discipline of sitting at the desk and writing. You cannot be a painter unless you are willing to live in isolation from time to time.
But why do we not have that environment? I mean, you started off by saying that the environment, in a way, is discouraging intellectual engagement.
Absolutely.
Do the comparisons then. If you agree with what Leslie was saying earlier on, that the 60s, 70s, 80s had intellectual engagement. Now we have less of that. But why?
I'll tell you my reading of it. If you look at Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo, they were what I would call, and I would use a Gramscian term, I wouldn't call them public intellectuals, I would call them organic intellectuals. They were trained in the sphere of legal, academic and sphere of legal practice, and decided to use their skills, their knowledge, and everything they had in the service of a cause that they believed in. Now, the consequences for that were dire, right? Their families also got affected tremendously. So the mood even then was not easy, right? Firstly, I want to say that I believe that there is actually a definition that I use as a working definition for intellectuals. And it's basically people who are willing to study and interpret issues and go beyond what is visible, what is obvious, and try to understand very probing questions and very uncomfortable questions. Now, in the 1960s, in that vibrancy, let's also not forget the fact that people like Ruth First, who was a journalist who used her training as a journalist, for example, during the potato boycott, to make visible the suffering that was happening in different kinds of situations, that she was repaid by 90 days in detention.
Sure.
So today, but I think also that part of the problem is that there is also this assumption that if you question certain issues, you are also questioning decisions and processes that are being made by people who are in power, people that you were in battle trenches with.
But isn't that intellectual dishonesty itself? I mean, one of the things that Leslie mentions in the book is studying of social reality. And if you study social reality then, yet you refuse to tell it like you see it, that is intellectual dishonesty.
Dishonesty and cowardice.
So in other words, there's a lot of intellectual dishonesty and cowardice going on in this society.
In my subjective view, yes, there is a lot of that. You often see this on TV and on radio. Somebody who's supposed to give insights into some or other political or social development. And they will say, on the one hand, this, on the one hand, that, which means they never arrive at a conclusion at all. And these are the rent-a-coat experts and reflectors upon society that people have to rely upon, and they offer people nothing.